In an old royal portrait, the child's face is pale, almost translucent, and the veins beneath the skin seem strangely visible. Some viewers call that elegance, others see a clue. That detail matters because the phrase blue blood did not appear in one place only. It surfaced again and again across languages, courts, and centuries. In Spanish, sangre azul. In English, blue blood. On the surface, it sounds like a metaphor for privilege, but the wording itself keeps pointing somewhere deeper. Because in many old traditions, power was not described as wealth alone. It was described as bloodline, inheritance, and something almost biological. That's where Tartaria enters the story. On old maps, it was not a footnote, but a massive region occupying much of the northern world. Then, almost as if someone pulled a curtain, that name began to disappear from the official historical picture. Not everywhere at once, but steadily. And when old place names vanish, old power structures often shift with them. The maps change first. The stories follow later. Across many traditions, rulers were said to descend from beings unlike ordinary men. Sometimes those beings were divine. Sometimes they were described as something in between. Egyptian royal records spoke of a special life force tied to the dynasty. Chinese imperial stories pointed to dragon ancestry. The pattern kept repeating. In the Sumerian king list, kingship is said to have descended from heaven. That wording is strange because it does not describe a rise. It describes a transfer. And then there are the Nephilim stories, where human women and non-human beings are said to produce a mixed lineage. Whether literal or symbolic, the language is remarkably persistent. If these stories were isolated, they would be easy to dismiss. But they appear in separate cultures, separated by distance, language, and time. So the question becomes sharper. Why do so many old ruling lineages begin with a being that is not fully human? That is where the story starts to tighten. Official explanations usually point to shared myth and symbolic borrowing. That's plausible, until you notice how the same pattern appears before contact was even possible. Because in the Tartaria narrative, the break is not subtle. A world that once seemed fully mapped begins to lose its older labels and older centers. Then come the dynasties. Old houses do not simply vanish. They return under cleaner paperwork, tidier family trees, and more polished beginnings. And once those records become clean, the older questions become harder to ask. Who was the family before the family? What was removed from the line? This is where some researchers point to unusual portraits. The heads look elongated, the faces delicate, the proportions unlike the surrounding figures. In one palace painting after another, the same visual tension returns. The artist may have meant symbolism, or the artist may have copied what was seen. That possibility changes everything, because if these were only symbols, why do similar body patterns appear in different regions and different empires? At the same time, old references to blood begin sounding less like poetry and more like classification. Not every elite was merely rich. Some were described differently. Blue blood in that reading becomes more than etiquette. It becomes a surviving label attached to a very old idea about ruling lineages. And the deeper you go, the more the silence matters. Missing records, altered maps, and clean genealogies all seem to point toward the same hidden transition. Some historians would call that coincidence. Others would call it a pattern waiting for someone to notice. And this is where the Tartaria question becomes unavoidable. Because if Tartaria was never just a place on a map, then the blue blood elite may have been preserving a lineage far older than modern history admits. In a dim archive room, a clerk opens a ledger marked with royal bloodlines. The first page is missing, but the index still names families tied to Tartaria. That missing page matters, because in old court systems, lineage was not just recorded. It was guarded, edited, and sometimes quietly erased before anyone could compare it. In several European houses, the phrase blue blood appears beside references to inherited privilege. The wording looks social at first, until it starts appearing like a coded marker. And once you compare those references with dynastic marriage records, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. The same families were protected by the same language across generations. Meanwhile, in old maps, Tartaria does not appear as a single kingdom. It stretches across vast spaces, as if cartographers were mapping a political world we no longer recognize. That is why some researchers focus on the transition period. When empires modernized their archives, older place names vanished, but elite family names often survived in cleaner form. In court portraits, children of ruling houses are often drawn with unusual head proportions. Supporters called it style, but repetition across regions makes the explanation feel incomplete. The same kind of visual oddity appears in Mesoamerican noble imagery and in ancient burial art from South America. Different cultures, similar elite bodies, similar emphasis on inheritance. At this point, a skeptic will say the images only reflect sacred status. Maybe. But sacred status still had to be visually recognizable, and that is where the debate begins. The more unusual detail is the secrecy. Bloodline tests, succession rites, and private inspections appear in scattered references, but the records refuse to stay complete. And when a record is described in a later source but absent from the original archive, the question changes. It is no longer what survived, it is what was removed. Some lineages in the 19th century even claimed extraordinary purity of descent, as if the family itself had to be proven before the public ever saw the crown. That wording sounds ceremonial, but it also sounds biological. If authority needed proof at that level, then descent may have carried more weight than modern historians like to admit. What exactly were they trying to prove? Now bring Tartaria back into focus. In the older travel accounts, its rulers are described in ways that blur ethnicity, region, and even ordinary human category. That is where the blue blood idea becomes unsettling. Not because the phrase proves anything by itself, but because it keeps appearing near claims of exceptional lineage. A single motif does not prove a hidden dynasty, but multiple motifs, repeated in separate archives, create a pressure that simple coincidence struggles to absorb. This is why some historians keep returning to court artists, not just chroniclers. Artists may exaggerate, but they also preserve what patrons wanted remembered. If the same body type, the same ceremonial distance, and the same bloodline emphasis appear together, the image stops being decorative. It starts looking like a category. The problem is that official archives rarely describe categories in plain language. They bury them in etiquette, genealogy, and ritual, where only specialists know what to look for. And in Tartaria, that same style of buried description is exactly what keeps returning: fragments, omissions, and clues that look accidental until they are placed side by side. By the time those fragments reach modern scholarship, the trail is already thin. A few references survive, but the supporting material has often disappeared into silence. That silence is what makes the blue blood question so persistent. A metaphor can explain a phrase, but it struggles to explain a coordinated historical pattern. So the story is not simply about nobles with unusual symbols. It is about a vanished framework that may have determined who counted as legitimate in the first place. If that framework existed, then Tartaria was not just a territory to be redrawn. It was part of the stage on which an older elite identity may have been hidden in plain sight. And that leaves one final question hanging over the record. If the blue blood elite came from there, what else about Tartaria was preserved only after it was already disappearing? In an old Russian atlas, Tartary stretches across half a continent, but the labels are not just geographic, they hint at courts, borders, and forgotten centers of power. The strange part is not the size of the name, it is how often the mapmakers place power where later historians expected emptiness. Some of those later maps erase Tartary almost overnight, not the land itself, but the naming system that once made the region legible. That kind of disappearance rarely happens by accident. Names vanish when institutions decide the old frame is no longer useful. In the travel accounts that survived, Tartary is never just a blank zone. It appears as a place with roads, gates, customs, and guarded thresholds. Those accounts also describe unusual standards of order. Warehouses, relay stations, and administrative posts suggest a network built to control movement. If that network once existed at scale, then the question becomes political. Who benefited when the old terminology was replaced by something safer? The answer may lie in the sudden standardization of genealogies. Once dynasties needed cleaner beginnings, older roots became inconvenient. That is where Tartaria stops looking like a forgotten empire and starts looking like a missing chapter. The gap itself becomes the evidence. One strange clue appears in court art. Portraits of noble children from different regions often share unusually elongated head shapes. Artists could flatter a face, exaggerate posture, or simplify clothing. But when the skull itself keeps appearing, the pattern gets harder to dismiss. Now place those portraits beside royal burial masks and stone reliefs. The same shape returns across places that should not share the same visual habits. That does not prove a hidden bloodline, but it does suggest a shared elite ideal, or a shared source of authority behind the images. And then there are the buried references to inspection rituals. Court succession, inheritance, and coronation all seem to involve private examinations. These examinations were not modern medicine. They were gatekeeping moments, where lineage may have mattered less than what the body revealed. If the records are missing, that absence matters. Catalogue references survive, but the documents themselves often do not. That pattern repeats across empires. A transition happens, archives are reorganized, and the older family lines suddenly become less visible. The official explanation is always administrative efficiency, yet administrative efficiency rarely explains why entire ancestral records are quietly recentered. Tartaria becomes important because it sits inside that same transformation. A region disappears, and a new elite memory is built over the void. That is why the blue blood phrase matters here. It arrives in the language of nobility exactly when bloodlines themselves are being re-authenticated. If that phrase was only poetic, why does it keep appearing beside dynastic legitimacy, inheritance law, and courtly separation from ordinary people? A theory like this does not need every archive to survive. It only needs enough surviving fragments to show that something larger was being managed. So the origin story may not begin with a single family. It may begin with a system that learned how to hide its own starting line. And once you notice that, the old maps stop looking like curiosities. They start looking like instructions left behind before the page was torn away, which means the next question is not where Tartaria was on a map. It is who decided its elite had to disappear before the story could continue. In a dim archive, a torn map of Tartary still shows a frontier that later vanished from official atlases. The absence is not blank space. It feels edited. The first clues are not in monuments, but in travel logs. European merchants kept describing Tartarian nobles as tall, composed, and strangely separate from nearby populations. Those descriptions matter because they repeat across writers who never met one another. When unrelated observers sound alike, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. Then there are the court inventories. They list robes, seals, and ceremonial objects, but leave a strange gap where the succession records should be. In several imperial households, that gap appears right beside family names. A line can survive in memory, but if paperwork is gone, the official version becomes easier to control. Some researchers point to ritual examinations performed before coronations. These were not ordinary inspections. They were private, guarded, and rarely written down in plain language. What were they looking for? No surviving ledger says it openly, but the very silence suggests the question was considered too sensitive to preserve. The same uncertainty appears in older paintings of princely children. Their skull shapes are emphasized in ways that seem too consistent to be accidental. In the Paracas material, that same elongated profile appears again. Different continent, different tradition, yet the visual language feels unnervingly familiar. And then the records go quiet again. Every time the subject gets specific, the archive seems to prefer symbolism over explanation. Tartaria's disappearance makes that silence louder. Once the region was large enough to occupy entire maps, then it was reduced to a footnote almost overnight. That kind of cartographic reduction rarely happens alone. It usually travels with new borders, new rulers, and a cleaner story for the people left behind. If the elite line survived the political transition, the paperwork would need to be perfect. That is exactly where the surviving documents become oddly uniform. That perfection can feel suspicious, because real inheritance leaves mess behind. Here, the mess seems removed before anyone could compare notes. Some researchers argue the blue blood idea may have begun as a visible marker, then hardened into a class myth. But visible veins alone do not explain the ritual obsession around bloodlines, because ritual language keeps returning to purity, descent, and difference. Those are not casual terms. They are the vocabulary of guarded hierarchy. Once that vocabulary spread, it was easy to apply it across dynasties. What started as a local code could become an international way to mark the untouchable. The same thing may explain why so many royal portraits feel carefully staged. The artist is not just painting power, he may be preserving a distinction. In that case, the paintings become documents with brushstrokes, not proof perhaps, but evidence that someone wanted a specific kind of body remembered. Then there is the problem of continuity. If these elite were ordinary families, why do so many records begin abruptly, as if older chapters were copied over? That abruptness is especially visible around the 18th century. Whole administrations seem to smooth the past while pretending only to organize it. And yet, the names keep recurring. Different courts, different languages, similar gestures toward blood, legitimacy, and separation from common people. That is why the Tartarian elite question matters. If the map was altered, the lineage might have been altered too, and the two changes could be connected. If that connection is even partly real, then the disappearance of Tartaria was not just geographic, it was also a way of cutting off a family's story. And that leaves one final possibility hanging over the archive. Somewhere beyond the missing pages, another record may still explain who Tartaria's blue blood elite really were. At the edge of the archive, one missing record still matters. If Tartaria's blue blood elite existed, this is where their trail would have ended or begun. Because the pattern keeps repeating, a noble line appears, then the paperwork thins out. That is the moment where legends start sounding suspiciously like administration. In old court language, blood was not just ancestry. It was a status marker, a boundary, and sometimes a warning wrapped inside a compliment. And if a ruling house wanted to preserve that boundary, the cleanest method was simple: control the record before anyone asked the wrong question. That is why Tartaria matters here. Not as a fantasy empire, but as a name that once covered enormous spaces before later maps began to narrow the story. When that label fades from public memory, the people attached to it become easier to reclassify. A vanished map can hide more than geography. Across old imperial stories, the rulers are described as different from ordinary people. Sometimes that difference is spiritual, sometimes biological, and sometimes deliberately left vague. That vagueness is not a weakness. It is what makes the story survive across cultures, even when the names change and the kingdoms do not know each other. Then the portraits appear. Not one portrait, but generations of them, with the same elongated heads and unsettling proportions returning again and again. A single painting can be dismissed. A repeating family trait across centuries is harder to brush away. That is where the argument begins to tighten. And then there are the rituals. The more carefully the succession is guarded, the more likely someone is inspecting what cannot be openly named. No one wrote down the details in a way that survives cleanly. We are left with references, omissions, and the uneasy sense that the important page never stayed intact. That silence becomes louder when the same kind of omission appears around Tartarian records. The documents exist in traces, but the core explanation keeps slipping away. So the question shifts. If the elite were only ordinary nobles, why do the stories of their bodies, their blood, and their origin keep sounding different from everyone else's? Some researchers argue that those stories are not random at all. They may be fragments of a controlled lineage preserved through ceremony rather than science. If that is true, then the archive was never just preserving history. It was protecting a hierarchy, one page, one portrait, and one bloodline at a time. And yet even that is still a theory. The surviving record gives us patterns, not proof, which is exactly why the silence matters so much. Because when a story is weak, it can be dismissed. When it's repeated across empires, centuries, and rituals, it starts to demand a different kind of attention. That is why the blue blood idea keeps returning. It may be metaphor, it may be class language, or it may be the feigned language of a lineage people no longer knew how to describe. Maybe that is why the old families guarded their papers so carefully. They were not only defending property, they were defending the story of what they were. And when that kind of story survives only in fragments, every fragment becomes dangerous. A single portrait, a missing ledger, A strange ritual note can change everything. So the true origin of Tartaria's blue blood elite may not be a single document. It may be the shadow cast by many documents that no longer speak aloud. That shadow points to a ruling class that seems to have been rebuilt, renamed, and re-verified until the earlier version became almost impossible to recover. But if the line was remade so carefully, what exactly was being hidden? Bloodline, allegiance, or the memory of where that power began? And maybe that is the final unease. Not that history forgot them, but that history learned to describe them in safer language. Because every safer language leaves behind a sharper question, and in Tartaria's case the question is whether the elite were preserving an ancient order or replacing it. Because if one record still survives beyond the missing pages, it could show whether Tartaria's blue blood elite were myth, mask, or something far stranger than either. And if that record names the first source of their authority, then everything we thought was inherited may have been engineered instead.